This is about Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, and this is going to culminate into two trials. One of the trials is 1971 New York Times versus U.S. decision, which that trial by itself says that Julian Assange is not guilty. He's acquitted, exonerated. He's absolutely well within his, American rights, which also standing is a big question with Julian Assange. Right, you got a case against an Australian citizen who published stuff in Slovenia or wherever his servers in Europe are, so maybe U.S. servers were used. So ultimately, the 1971 Supreme Court case, New York Times versus U.S., exonerates Julian Assange. We don't even need to talk about it. As soon as we mention that case, which you don't, the stare decisis, you're not a big stare decisis, and using the precedent, the use of precedent, you're not big on that, huh? So I thought that's what justices were all about. So ultimately, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but first, Ellsberg. Okay, so Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers are 7,000 pages of a Robert McNamara report on the Vietnam War, on the U.S. policy in Vietnam. And it showed from Truman to Eisenhower to JFK to LBJ, and how in Truman, so how all those presidents, it was Nixon, right? 1971's Nixon. So the Pentagon Papers had, documented exactly what happened. So it's just 7,000 pages of probably the most boring sets of information and facts and figures that you could ever come across. But it had said that it lied, that the presidents were lying. Our government was not being honest about our involvement or our level of involvement in Vietnam. So we had been fighting in Vietnam under several presidencies, and every single one of those presidents were lying. And at that time, I guess, the implicit infallibility of presidents was being destroyed. So the president was like the Pope. They were infallible. They could not do anything, They can do no wrong. And so the Pentagon Papers worried Nixon, because if now the implicit infallibility of presidents were being destroyed, well, now Nixon might go down. And so for 15 days, they're going to block the New York Times. Nixon, the executive branch of the U.S. government, is going to file an injunction, and one of these courts, lower district courts, is going to issue an injunction on the New York Times to bar them from publishing anything written in the Pentagon Papers. So Daniel Ellsberg's crime ultimately was handing those 7,000 pages to the New York Times journalist Neil Sheehan. And then he's going to write an article about them, one or two or so. And then also the Washington Post is going to get on it. And then there's some information and intelligence think tanks that had the Pentagon Papers too. So a couple people got their hands on the Pentagon Papers. And then ultimately Mike Gravel is going to read it into the Senate record. So the crime is Daniel Ellsberg took the Pentagon Papers, which was classified. He says it was illegally classified because it really had no secret information. But that's the crime, was that he took classified information and he gave it to the people. He gave it to the public. Now, if a publisher believes that it's in the best interest of the people to have knowledge on a certain thing, that's all they need to know in order to publish. The public has a right to know. And the press has the freedom of the press. They have the right to publish. And the First Amendment says no law can be passed to abridge. So you cannot stop the publication, especially if it's a third party. So in the case of Julian Assange, and comparing it to the Daniel Ellsberg case, Daniel Ellsberg would be the Bradley Manning, the Chelsea Manning figure. So Daniel Ellsberg would be the leaker, the government agent who had classified information that gave it to somebody else. So that would be, if there's any crime at all, that would be the crime. It would have been what Daniel Ellsberg did. And what Julian Assange did was he was more like the New York Times and the Washington Post. He was not the person that had the classified information. Chelsea Manning had the classified information. Then Chelsea Manning gave the classified information to Julian Assange, and Julian Assange published it. So Daniel Ellsberg would have been the one who would be the guilty party because he's the government agent who leaked information, classified information, but he gave it to American publishers, and he also he gave it to American publishers, and I guess that's he also didn't believe that it was supposed to be classified. So he thought it was in the best interest for the public to have the information of what the government had. The government had the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. That is in the public interest to have. The public should know what their government is doing in Vietnam or in any country at all. And so history and the Supreme Court decision, 1971 New York Times versus U.S., is the Pentagon Papers case, but it's not the Daniel Ellsberg case. So the Pentagon Papers case says that it's okay for the New York Times and the Washington Post to go ahead and publish the Pentagon Papers. They were not in any trouble. In fact, that Supreme Court case was very one-sided in favor of free speech. Nixon tried to say national security was at stake, and therefore they needed to stop publishing because of national security. But the Supreme Court, 1971 New York Times v. U.S. case says no. No, the right to publish trumps national security. At least with this specific case it does. And so if you can make the case that it's in the public's right to know, and you have the right to, the First Amendment, you have the right to publish, the right to the press, the right to express yourself, the right to speak and write whatever opinions you want to write and speak about, then Julian Assange is not guilty. He's not guilty. He's not the one that was stealing classified information. Once it's released, the criminal might be Daniel Ellsberg or Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning, who's already served Private Manning's time. So Private Manning is served. They did their time. They did their time. She did her time. She's not a she. You're surgically. That's weird. It's weird. So, okay, whatever. Private Manning did their time, right? Private Manning did the time that was assigned to Private Manning, and so they can't hold him in double jeopardy, and therefore, if there's a guilty party with WikiLeaks, which the collateral damage, would be the biggest case or classified information that was released, it would be that, and so Chelsea Manning would be the guilty party if there's anybody that's guilty. But ultimately, the truth is going to prevail, and these are whistleblowers, and history will absolve them in the long run. And so the argument, really the only thing we need to figure out right now is, are we going to do the right thing at this point in time right now? Are we going to do the right thing right now? Are we going to do what our own history and our own Supreme Court precedent has said with the 1971 New York Times versus U.S. case? So I want to make that distinction because when you just think about the 1971 New York Times, case, Julian Assange isn't Daniel Ellsberg. Chelsea Manning's Daniel Ellsberg, and Julian Assange is the New York Times and the Washington Post. And if you think about literally what does Julian Assange do, he's not, there's newspapers or citizen journalists, but the WikiLeaks, their kind of organization, they're publishers of original documents. And that's, in some sense, that's more powerful than what much of the corporate media does. So Julian Assange is a publisher. He found information, and he published it. A publisher of original documents. And so, therefore, it's up for the public and the journalist and anybody to go check it out for yourself. Here are the original documents. Now you get to determine what you believe, is the truth and what isn't the truth. So Julian Assange is 100% the publisher. Julian Assange is the New York Times and the Washington Post. They want to try to say he's not a journalist. Even if he's just a citizen, you have a right to be a citizen journalist. And so if you're a third party and you had absolutely nothing to do with, the stealing of the information or the leaking of the information or the giving of the information, it would be the person who did it. That would be, the person that gets it and displays it all over the place. The Supreme Court says it's okay. In name of national security, you have to prove that you have to say, okay, we have to throw Julian Assange in jail because you have to prove that national security is really in jeopardy, that he really put people's lives are in jeopardy and national security is really at stake. You really got to make that case. Because if you don't make the case that national security, it's a hard burden. It's a huge burden. It was Hugo Black. Hugo Black was the one that was on the 1971 New York Times case. And so Chelsea Manning is free now, and now it's time for Julian Assange to get free. So yeah, why should Julian Assange, if it goes, because it's possible that this extradition case over there in Europe, in the United Kingdom, Julian Assange could be shipped over the Atlantic Ocean and tried in a federal court in Virginia. And if it comes to Virginia, then it'll be based upon American laws. It seems hypocritical that we could, shoot a Mexican in Mexican territory, and they're not allowed to use the U.S. Constitution in order to sue, but it's perfectly fine and dandy to go to Europe and say that they're breaking our laws, so we can break their laws. We just, they can't break ours. So standing, I think, is a huge thing, right? I think he's Australian citizen. He's over there in Europe, and so what the fuck? What does it got to do with America? It was an American. Bradley, Chelsea Manning is the one that got the documents. If there's a criminal, I don't believe even what Chelsea did. It's whistleblowing. So Chelsea was just saying, this shit's going down, and I don't know what else to say or do about it except for tell the public, because maybe they'll be publicly shamed in doing what they're supposed to do. If we're the good guys, if we're the good people, and there's a crime that goes down, wouldn't you be on the side of the people the good men who says, we shouldn't be killing innocent journalists and shooting kids and innocent bystanders. We shouldn't be shooting and murdering innocent people. Don't you want to be on the side that says we're not murdering innocent people? So the New York Times versus the U.S. 1971 Supreme Court case, hands down, proves the U.S. government's got no case. If it's a fair trial, okay, and that's a big if. If the judge isn't mobbed up, because who the fuck knows who the 1% knows? Who knows who's pulling the strings to any of these people? But if the judge is fair, 1971 New York Times v. U.S. Get the hell out of here, Julian Assange. You don't need to be here in America. You don't need to be in jail. And in fact, every moment, because it was 15 days that the New York Times was not allowed to print, but Hugo Black said for every moment that they're not allowed to print is a moment that is a mockery to the First Amendment, to the freedom of the press and the freedom of the speech. Every moment. So it's been 15 days. In 1971, with Julian Assange, he's been in jail for a year. So for some contempt, 50 weeks in jail for some kind of contempt case or some shit. And it's all about, extraditing him over to America, which the Justice Department of our government did formally request. So, Donald Trump says he loves WikiLeaks. But then he says, well, I love him, but then let's throw him in jail anyways, because fuck the First Amendment and fuck the rights of publishers to publish primary sourced documents. Primary sourced documents, instead of a third-hand, narrative account from some asshole who thinks they know everything. But here's the original primary sourced documents. So he leaked a bunch of stuff, nothing dangerous, but why is Julian Assange in trouble? It's embarrassing. Many powerful elites, many governments, so the 1%, he's been a thorn in the side of the 1%, the wealthy and the people in power. So they just want to fuck Assange over for telling us the truth. So if there's a martyr, that's Julian Assange has fell upon his cross, just like Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden has. All three of these men, incredible, courageous men, and the longer that this shit goes on, the more that I admire and respect them. Because ultimately I thought, maybe people might be mad at first, but of course, Daniel Ellsberg, 1971, Pentagon Papers, Muhammad Ali, Vietnam War, all this shit. Even the Weather Underground is going to be exonerated. So ultimately, if you're on the right side of history, America will welcome you back. So Julian Assange is on the right side of history because he's on the side of truth. He can't go wrong with truth. And it's, Peru, there's a whole bunch of accomplishments. I want to talk about his accomplishments soon enough. But Julian Assange is not guilty according to American jurisprudence, according to American law, if it's a fair case. If they're going to say, that he's a publisher, and even if they say he's a citizen, you're allowed to publish if you're a citizen. There's no real standard for what a press is. Any citizen can print up a newspaper, publish anything on Facebook or online, anywhere that they go. So Daniel Ellsberg also, he's going to have the distinction with making a connection with the Watergate, scandal. So now let's get to the details of Daniel Ellsberg. So the Supreme Court case was against the New York Times, Washington Post, and newspapers, and they were trying to stop the newspapers from printing the Pentagon Papers. But it was Daniel Ellsberg, and he's the one that released the Pentagon Papers, and they arrested him, and they charged him with the Espionage Act, and for giving classified information or whatever. So they're saying he's a spy, and it had a felony charges. He was looking at 300 years or 115 years or some shit in prison. So he's looking at massive felony charges, 115 years in prison. So Daniel Ellsberg, he's a Marine. He's a U.S. soldier, so that's fantastic. This is how we treat our soldiers. Born in 1931, Chicago, Illinois. He's 88 years old today. I believe he's still alive. In 1931, that's the same year as the Neer v. Minnesota decision, which had a three-pronged test for the limits of free speech. And Herbert Hoover was president in 1931. The Great Depression just happened 2 years prior. And FDR is going to win the 1932 election. He's going to sweep the map. He's going to take Herbert Hoover and just wipe his face all across the map of the United States. So a Democratic Socialist can win, has won, 1932, then 36, then 40, then 44. He won 4 terms. Democratic Socialism was wildly popular in 1932. So Daniel Ellsberg, born in 1931, that's a little bit about who he is. Now, he's going to work with the intelligence agency. Robert McNamara is going to want to know about the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Daniel Ellsberg is going to lead that team. Daniel Ellsberg is the one that's going to write the Pentagon Papers. Now, while this trial is going on, because Daniel Ellsberg gave the Pentagon Papers to lots of people, right? He gave it to Mike Gravel, Washington Post, New York Times, and then some think tank. So he's just kind of passing it out to anybody and everybody, which is a smart tactic. Because if you have information, if everybody has it, then most likely everybody will eventually find out about it. And if you get in trouble, at least the information is still out there. So Daniel Ellsberg, this is really getting under, Richard Nixon's crawl. He's, really irked. Richard Nixon is irked. He's biffed. Richard Nixon is irked and biffed at Daniel Ellsberg because what the fuck, how dare Daniel Ellsberg do this to Nixon? Nixon took it personal. And so Nixon ordered his plumbers, the same guys that's going to break into Watergate, broke into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, Lewis Fielding's office, and went and found his file, found nothing in it, and then just threw it on the ground in a haste. So Nixon was looking for the mother lode of information on Daniel Ellsberg's mental state because he's talking to a psychiatrist. Clearly he's got to have some fucking issues, right? The break-in came to light during Ellsberg and Russo's trial in April 1973. So, whereas the New York Times is just saying we get a right to publish these Pentagon Papers, at the same time, Daniel Ellsberg is being charged with the Espionage Act. So we have 2 separate trials here. And during that Ellsberg and Russo's trial in April 1973, we're going to find out that Lewis Fielding, a psychiatrist for Daniel Ellsberg, the office was broken into. So clearly they're trying to look for information, look for dirt on Daniel Ellsberg. They're trying to just, hurt Daniel Ellsberg in some shape, way, or form. And that's actually ultimately going to help him because the judge who seemed to be against Daniel Ellsberg is going to be like, well, that's not right. What's going on here? What the hell is happening? And he just throws his hands up in disgust and dismisses the case because of the FBI was surveilling, domestic surveillance, illegal wiretapping, and then this, breaking into his psychiatrist's office, just a lot of misconduct when it comes to the side of the prosecution and the executive branch. And what the fuck was Richard Nixon doing recording himself on the Watergate thefts? I heard him literally say that, fuck this guy, fuck Daniel Ellsberg, go into his, I don't know if they said Lewis Fielding, but he's basically just right there on tape, let's break into this guy's office, get all this information, we need to sink Ellsberg, because fuck this son of a bitch. So what a psycho, what a crazy psycho. Nixon records himself when it comes to Daniel Ellsberg, when it comes to Watergate, when it comes to all of, the plumbers. So what a fucking psycho, just for the sake of history. He thought he was just so that goddamn important, he wanted posterity to know every bit of his dirty mafia-like orchestrations, his break-ins, his burglaries, his crookedness, his office invasions, breaking and entering and stealing, trespassing, property damage. That's who the president, and he said, if you're president, it's not illegal. And he wound up, he was right? He got pardoned, so he got to do he ordered all this shit. And then when it came to light, I guess the public shame and the impeachment articles, he was like, well, fuck, I don't have a choice here. But he didn't go to jail, nor did he pay a fine, nor did he get spanked. Nobody took Nixon and bent him over their knee and took him out by the woodshed and just did, what his old daddy used to do to him. He needed to be spanked. He needed to be punished for all the bullshit that he did. So that's a crazy-ass connection. I didn't know that. That Watergate, the plumbers that broke into the Watergate, the DNC and all that eventually sinks Nixon, they had first broken into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist, Lewis Fielding's office first. So the holding for the 1971 New York Times v. Nixon case is that the freedom of the press trumps national security, the right of the public to know trumps national security. You have to really make a strong argument to say that national security is in peril with the publishing of, this or that document. It's a 6-3 decision, so pretty, majority, overwhelming. Not a 5-4, but 6-3. Not unanimous, but not, barely either. So the Pentagon Papers case, the government just lied about the Vietnam War. Hugo Black is on the court, 6-3. Now, any system of prior restraints, this is their collective opinion. This court actually has 10 opinions. The only Supreme Court case that has 10 opinions. Because there's 9, so there's an extra one thrown in there somehow. So any system of prior restraints of expression comes to this court bearing a heavy presumption against its constitutional validity. That's Bantam Books v. Sullivan, 1963. But that was the opinion of the Supreme Court in 1971 with New York Times v. Nixon. So you come into this court trying to say that they don't have a freedom of the press, you're trying to say, and they call it prior restraint. We don't have prior restraint in America. You're not a true blue, freedom-loving, you're not a red, white, and blue American if you believe in prior restraint. Fuck prior restraint. Prior restraint don't define me. So that's what 1971 says, right? No prior restraint. And that's what the Supreme Court says. You come into this court trying to say that a publication can't print, you better have a good-ass reason. You're telling me that Julian Assange can't print on his website some of the, information that the public, it's in the public's interest and they have the right to know. You're telling me that he ain't allowed to publish? You better have a good-ass explanation. You better really show me where national security is in peril, because if you don't prove to me that national security is in peril, then get the fuck up out of this court. So the government carries a heavy burden of showing justification for the imposition of prior restraint. So the court itself didn't even make a judgment or a ruling about Daniel Ellsberg. They just made a ruling about the newspapers. So they're focused on the character of the documents and then the consequences of that disclosure. So Julian Assange wasn't even a factor. Daniel Ellsberg wasn't even a factor in this decision because the publishers are allowed to publish classified information that they get from anybody, the spies, CIA, KGB, any information publishers, reporters, citizen journalists come across, they're allowed to publish it. And especially if they're just a non-biased third party, right? They're just kind of walking down the street, somebody says, here's some information, and then keeps on running, and they take the information, and then they say, hey, everybody, look at this information I just found. They're allowed to publish. 100%. 1971, New York Times case, v. Nixon, checkmate. I don't need to talk, I don't need to say no more. But I will, because there's a lot of details, and I get something actually by explaining all these details in this case. Okay. So, is it that the government, is it really that national security is in peril? Is it really that all of our lives are in danger because Julian Assange published Collateral Damage, 13 years ago? We could see the effects of it. We could see the effects of the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers, did it destroy America? No, the truth helps America. It helps, the culture of our nation. The truth is a good thing. So, is it about national security, or did Nixon just not want to be embarrassed? It's clear as fucking day with the Pentagon Papers. Nixon just didn't want to be embarrassed, which it didn't even talk about Nixon. It just talked about past presidents lying about Vietnam, but a hit dog done hollered. He was like, what? They're saying that past presidents lied about Vietnam? Well, we can't allow anybody to know this, but they're Democrats, you know. Nixon, what's wrong with, well, the infallibility. People used to think presidents are fucking gods. Perfection, just immaculate diamonds. Just immaculate, perfect diamonds. That's just diamond-encrusted gods. And now they don't. Nixon, very, very insecure. And if it wasn't for Nixon cracking down on Ellsberg, you know, that wouldn't have led to the unraveling of the Watergate thing. He got addicted. He went into Ellsberg and was like, okay, even though I didn't find nothing, let's keep on breaking into people's, you know, houses and shit. Let's see what we can. And it is kind of nuts to think that your president is ordering just a bunch of, you know, burglaries, just a bunch of breaking and entering and stealing documents and shit. What are you doing today, Mr. President? Well, I'm going to order my henchmen to break into the Democratic National Committee so that way we can get dirt on them and beat them in the election. But, Mr. President, aren't you going to, like, help the country or lead the country or, you know, kind of put the country in the right direction, solve poverty, stop the wars or something? No, I'm just going to do this little personal thing for myself because, you know, because Richard Milhouse Nixon's a crook. Justice Harlan's dissent, he said they didn't have enough time to really decide if national security was an issue. We didn't have enough time. There's never any time, like Jesse from Saved by the Bell. There's never any time. Hugo Black concurrence. Every moment's continuance of the injunctions against these newspapers amounts to a flagrant, indefensible, and continuing violation of the First Amendment. Never should publications be enjoined, ever. Never, ever, ever. You can't halt the publication of current news of vital importance to the people of this country, said Hugo Black, Supreme Court Justice. Both Hugo Black and J. Douglas, another justice, they agreed that no law, the First Amendment says, no law can abridge the freedom of the press, speech, religion. No law can be passed. So, shit, 1971 Pentagon Papers, SCOTUS. Automatically, Judge Gerfing, they're going to say the security of the nation does not stop at the ramparts alone. We don't need to just secure the nation from outward attack from our own foreign enemies. We got to secure the nation of our freedoms and our rights. And the Judge Gerfing, this is a, you know, Pentagon Papers case, said that the government must suffer a cantankerous, obstinate, ubiquitous press, and it must be suffered by those in authority to protect America's freedom of expression and the right of the people to know. For our freedom-loving culture. For our freedom-loving culture. So, you know, we must not have prior restraint, which is what they're doing with Julian Assange right now. This is a clear-cut case. Absolutely, 100%. Julian Assange is the publisher. And every minute, every second, you know, he's the cantankerous, obstinate, ubiquitous press that you're afraid of. And it's good for the public. So Julian Assange is a martyr. It's good for the public. So June 30th, 1971 is when the 1971 Pentagon Papers case was decided by the Supreme Court. And it's going to affirm the lower courts that the government had not made the case that national security was actually in jeopardy. And then the stays entered June 25th, 1971 were vacated. So they entered the injunction, 15 days. They entered it, you know, I guess officially. But June 30th, they said no. The justices said that perhaps the New York Times went too far by publishing the Pentagon Papers, but it's not illegal. It might be in poor taste, but it's not illegal. And, you know, history will be the judge of whether it was good or not for the American people. But prior restraint was illegally and unconstitutionally enforced on the New York Times, just like prior restraint right now. By putting Julian Assange in jail, you are restraining him from publishing. And so that's illegal, and that's unconstitutional. Daniel Ellsberg is arrested, and it's a separate matter than the decision. He's arrested actually 2 days before the New York Times v. Nixon decision. He's charged with the espionage of 1917, with other charges including theft and conspiracy, and the total max sentence was 115 years. June 28, 1971, he turns himself into the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts in Boston. So right before The 1971 New York Times v. U.S. case makes their decision. So this seems very prescient. He's prophetic. He didn't know that the Supreme Court was going to, that's a good decision for Ellsberg's case, because if the